In this video, I'm going to cover the Bendix RSA Fuel Injection system used on Lycoming engines. Now, a brief overview of this system right here is that fuel is going to come in through the inlet, through a strainer, and down into the manual mixture control, where the manual mixture control, this is attached to the red knob in the cockpit, is going to operate this valve right here, which will either restrict or open these passages right here, allowing fuel to go, number one, through here over into the unmetered fuel, and through this way over here to the main metering jet, where it will measure and deliver the metered fuel. But what I want to do right now is talk about this section right here, the fuel regulator. So this is a more simplistic version of what we were looking at just a minute ago. Unfortunately, it's in black and white, but this is how the training manual provides it. So this right here, this part right here, is the fuel regulator that I want to talk about. Now, if you have watched the videos or have studied the pressure carburetors, there are some similarities between this and the pressure carburetors, but it works different. So what you need to do is kind of clear your mind of how a pressure carburetor works and just follow along with this one, because like I said, it is different. And if you try and match the two together, you're going to have problems with this, and that's not going to work out well for you. So right away, we can see some similarities, right? If we wanted to, we could label these chambers A, B, C, and D if we liked. So looking what we have right here, then chamber A is going to connect up through this tube right here in the venturi. So we have the airflow coming through here, through the throttle body, and we have a venturi represented by two halves right here. Remember, it's a circle, goes all the way around. But in a venturi, because of Bernoulli's principle, air is going to speed up through here, and we have air speeding up, the velocity increases, means the pressure is going to decrease. So right in this area here and here, same thing, we have a vacuum or low pressure area. So we have a vacuum that is acting on chamber A to draw air out this way. And we can see that down here, venturi suction in chamber A. And then chamber B, we have these impact tubes right here that sense air coming in. As the air comes in, it's going to go into these impact tubes, putting pressure into chamber B. So chamber B has impact air pressure, while A has venturi suction. Now these two chambers right here, A and B, those two chambers equal the air metering force. So I'll write that out here. So air metering force equals A plus B. And again, if you've been watching the pressure carburetors right now, you're thinking, well, wait a minute, that sounds familiar, and you'd be correct. Well, so far they match. Here's where things get different. So now we have fuel over here in the C and D, which is, again, similar to what we've seen with pressure carburetors, but now things are going to work a little bit different. So we have fuel entering through the fuel pump, right? We have a boost pump that's in the wing and an engine-driven fuel pump. And the fuel is going to come down into here, where it's going to go this way into C. Now, what does C contain but fuel inlet pressure? So C equals unmetered fuel, or fuel inlet pressure. So it has not been metered, as were before in a pressure carburetor that was held constant because it was metered. But now C is unmetered. And so that is going to be the pressure off the fuel pump, which is going to be the high one. And then we have D, which is metered fuel pressure, right in this chamber right here. And so what happens is the fuel comes in here and the unmetered goes into C, but it's going to come down through this orifice right here, which is the main metering jet, into D. So D is now going to have a loss of pressure compared to C. So we can see if unmetered fuel pressure was right here, then metered would be right over here, less. So, and looking at these gauges here, if this is impact air, then that's impact air, and that's less, it's suction. So because A is a suction. It's always going to be less than B. B is more. B is a pressure. And then C is going to be more because it is directly off the fuel pump, where D is going to be less because it went through the main metering jet. So C and D make up the fuel metering force. So the fuel metering force, but it's going to be a little different. So the larger of the two, again, is C at minus D. So it's C minus D makes up the fuel metering force. All right, so the way this works is we have air coming in through the throttle body, and we will say that we have the throttle in the open position. So we're up and running. We're not in the idle position, but we're running well. And so impact air is going to come in through the impact tubes, pressurizing B. So it's going to pressurize B, we'll use a pen here, and it is going to tend to move the diaphragm. So this right here is a flexible rubber diaphragm attached to this poppet right there. So we have this pressure in B is going to tend to move the poppet in the way that it's saying force, just happens to be that way. So to the right. And then in chamber A, because we have it attached here to the venturi where we have a low pressure area, that would mean a suction comes down in here. So we have a suction in A, which is going to tend to move the diaphragm in the same way, assisting B, also opening up the poppet valve. So this right here is attached to the rubber diaphragm. This rubber diaphragm is attached right here. This is a seal where the poppet is allowed to move back and forth inside of there. So, all right, so A and B are air metering force. Both tend to move the poppet to the right, opening this up right here. So the further we open up the throttle plate, the more airflow we're going to get, the more impact air we're going to get, the more suction we're going to get. Well, according to Bendix, by the way, this tends to stay relatively constant. Well, this tends to be the one that changes more, but don't let that kind of hang you up. We can simply say that the further the throttle opens, the more air metering force we're going to get, and the more the poppet is going to go to the right, because that'd be more impact air and more suction. All right, so now let's take a look at our fuel metering force though. So fuel is coming in off of the boost pump and it's going directly into C, where C is going to be equivalent to our fuel pump pressure. So C is unmetered fuel or fuel pump pressure. And then D, again, is our metered fuel pressure. It's less because it's already come through the metering orifice. So to use an example here to kind of look at what's happening here, we can make up just some numbers here. And we'll make this a little bit darker blue so it's easier to see. All right, so we can make up some numbers. Let's just say that, and then again, made up numbers. Let's say that A, because it's suction, it's not a lot, we'll give that a force of 0.5, right? It's like 0.5 what? Well, it's 0.5 whatever you want it to be, but we can think of PSI if you like, but it'd be a negative PSI. But I prefer to say it has a force of 0.5. And then B has a force of, let's say, 1.5. All right, so B has a force of 1.5. It's just a made up number, a force there. So that is the air metering force. So air metering force, AMF, equals 0.5 plus 1.5. So air metering force would be 2, and it's just a value of 2. All right, and when we think about poppets like this one right here in this type of system, and just like on the pressure carbs, the key word here is equilibrium. You want to keep this poppet in equilibrium. And if the equation is off, the poppet will move towards the higher side. And by that, what I mean that if air metering force equals 2, then the fuel metering force must also equal 2 to keep the poppet from moving back and forth. Well, if the air metering force went up to 3 and the fuel metering force stayed at 2, well, then the air metering force over here is greater, and it's going to move the poppet all the way over until this hits here and hits the stop, right? Because there's nothing to stop it except for the fact this works, and I'll show you how it works in a second. And the inverse is true. if the air metering force was 2 and the fuel metering force was 3, then fuel metering force is greater and it's going to move the poppet that way. And unless it went into equilibrium, it would go all the way until it stopped right there. So the idea is we have to find an equilibrium where the poppet will stop. It can open a little bit and stop, open a little bit, stop, open a little bit, stop, or the opposite, close a little bit, stop, close a little bit, stop, all right? So we want that to be an equilibrium. So this is the way it works, or my example right here. So now let's just say that we do have our air metering force right here. Air metering force is 2. So I'm going to clean this up just a little bit, so we can keep it kind of clean. Look what you're doing at. All right, so we have our air metering force equals 2. Remember that because we had 0.5 for the venturi or the suction and 1.5 for the impact air, which gave us 2. All right, so now, make this a little bit smaller. We have pressure in C, and let's just say our force in C equals 5. Well, if our air metering force is 2, then, and we want to be in equilibrium, we have to subtract our D from that. So our D should be 3 because 5 minus 3 equals 2. So that would mean the air metering force equals 2 and the fuel metering force equals 2, which means they are in equilibrium. All right, but now let's just imagine here for a second that the throttle is opened up a little bit more, and now we increase our air metering force. All right, so we increase our air metering force. Well, let's just make up some numbers here. So we'll say A now becomes, we'll say 1, all right? And B can be 1.75. All right, so now we have a force, A plus B, our air metering force of 2.75. All right, now remember, it has to be in equilibrium, but what happens first, because we added more air, the poppet is going to go to the right, which does allow more fuel to come through here and drain off. And we do need more fuel going to the engine because we have more air coming into the engine. So more air coming into the engine, we need more fuel going out to the engine. So this regulator here is supposed to figure that out. So we add more throttle, the A plus B increases, it opens up this right here, the poppet valve, creating more space right here. And so our C, because it is our fuel pressure coming in, well, the pump didn't change, right? The pump is still regulated and still doing the same thing. So then my C, I'll do it in red since it's fuel. So C is going to equal still 5. All right. So C equals 5 because it's coming off the fuel pump, which is regulated. So it stayed at 5. All right. But what happens to D? So because this opened up a little bit, now the pressure in D is going to drain off and actually be a little bit less. So before we had over here at D, we had D was a value of 3. We gave it a value of 3. But because the poppet valve opened up a little bit, the pressure in D is going to go down. Well, what does it go down to? Well, let's just say it went down to D equals 2.25. All right, well, 5 minus 2.25 should equal 2.75. So if my air metering force is 2.75 and my fuel metering force is 2.75 and those two are equal, then my regulator, my poppet valve, is back in equilibrium and it is not going to move. So we had a little bit more air metering force, opened up the poppet. The poppet opened up, which allowed this space to get bigger. Fuel was in here. It's allowed to drain off and go this way, which lowered the pressure here. C stayed constant just because it does off the fuel pump. And so that put it back in equilibrium. Now, the same thing is true in the opposite. If we were to close down the throttle a little bit, well, then my air metering force, we can say it went from 2.75 all the way back to 2. We can say it went back to 2. Well, if it goes back to 2 and my fuel metering force is currently 2.75, that means that this area right here, fuel metering force, is greater, because it's a 2.75, than 2. And since C and D move the poppet this way, it is going to close the poppet right there, increasing the pressure in D. So we had this one over here at 5. It will increase the pressure over here to about, well, it have to, for our math to work out, it'd be exactly 3, which gives a fuel metering force of 2 and an air metering force of 2. And so the whole thing is back in equilibrium. And that's the way that this is going to work. So just remember that if you're getting confused between this and a pressure carburetor, it is that C still remains constant, but D, instead of letting fuel into the regulating unit, it's actually now draining it off and lowering the pressure, as where on a pressure carb, it actually increased the pressure in D. So this time it's dropping the pressure in D. All right, so enlarging the fuel regulator, yet again, we can take a closer look at what's going on inside of there and note that there are a few springs in there, and we want to talk about what those springs do. So we have a constant head idle spring. It would have been helpful if they would have wrote that there. In fact, I will put that right there. Constant head idle, IDL, idle spring, and the constant effort spring. So here's the constant head idle spring and the constant effort spring. And the reason why I like to make sure that we call this a constant head idle spring is so you can remember where does it work, and that is at idle is where it works. So getting familiar with what we're looking at right here, here is of course the servo valve, because it is labeled servo valve, or the poppet valve as I've been calling it. We have the chambers here. This was D. We have C right here. Then we have this air chamber over here, which is the impact air. So we were calling that B. And then over on this side here, which really isn't being represented well, there would be another chamber or wall right here. Then we're looking at the Venturi suction right in here, which is A. So we have the D, C, B, and A chambers right there. All right. As with the pressure carburetors, the problem with this particular fuel injection system is that it is relying on air metering force, A plus B, to move the poppet valve off its seat to allow fuel to come this way and off into the engine. Except that air metering force at idle is insufficient to actually move the poppet valve off of its seat and allow fuel to flow. So just like with the pressure carb, there has to be a means to actually open the poppet valve and allow fuel to go through with no air metering force. And the way that is done is with the constant head idle spring. All right, so the drawing is a little bit confusing, but try and help you through it. So let me see here if we can get some colored pens going right here. We have to realize that, well, first of all, that this part right here has the spring inside of it. So the spring is going to tend to move this item this way, which is attached to the poppet valve, moving all of this that way. All right, and this right here, so here's the diaphragm. That diaphragm does have a metal piece right in the middle, and then it goes back to being a rubber diaphragm. It is all the way up to and against the stop right here. And this is a piece of metal. This does not move. This little accordion thing right here, that is the seal that keeps the air side and the fuel side separate. So we don't want fuel to work its way down this way into the air, and we don't want air to work its way through there into the fuel. So this right here is a seal, and now we have a spring, and the spring pushes against this right here, which is attached to this right here, which moves the poppet that way, and it is pushing back against this in that means right there. But right now we have no air metering force, and so there should be a gap. So if we drew this correctly, I would put a gap right there, and then I would move this shaft out a little bit, and then I would show the space right here. But they didn't draw it that way, which I think makes things a little bit more difficult. So imagine that. We have some space right here, and the servo valve is off the seat. Well, that'd be on the seat now, wouldn't it? But it moves out, so we have enough fuel coming through here at idle. And we're going to look at something a little bit that helps regulate that fuel at idle. But this is just going to stay open and allow fuel to flow through enough for a fast idle. Now, as the throttle is opened, air metering force is going to increase. So we're going to have more pressure in this area pushing that way and more suction in this area pulling that way. And so as air metering force increases and tends to move the diaphragm that way, then that space that was right here is going to go away, because this block right here is going to go push against the spring until these two pieces right here kind of lock in together. And then all of this moves together now with the diaphragm. So the spring just held it open just enough for fuel to flow through, gave a little bit of space right there. As air metering force increases, this piece right here is going to come up until it bumps into that. And then all together, both of these pieces are going to move that way as air metering force increases. And because these two pieces are locked to that, it will move the servo ball that way, or the poppet that way, opening it up more and more. Then on the other side, of course, as we already talked about, we have chamber C, inlet pressure, and chamber D. The metered fuel is going to come down through, and then more will go out as the air metering force goes up. Now, we also have the constant effort spring. And I guess the easiest way to think about the constant effort spring is without it, the whole thing is a little clunky and a little maybe underpowered. So remember, this diaphragm here had to overcome the spring pressure until these two locked in. Well, the constant effort spring, as you can see right here, it's really just a spring that is always there, blocked up against this piece doesn't move, pushing this way, taking this piece and moving it that way. So all it's doing is constantly assisting what is happening in this chamber right here to move the diaphragm to the right. So that's why we can say it's constant, because it's always there and it just helps out what's happening in chamber, well, we're calling it B this case, chamber B, the impact air chamber, to help it out. So constant head idle spring helps it out and through idle because there's not enough air metering force, and the constant effort spring continually helps out, just adds a little bit of effort to the impact air. All right, looking back again at our big color drawing, unfortunately, this was drawn backwards to what we've been looking at. We have the servo ball to the right instead of to the left, but everything works the same way, and it's the same thing. We have air coming in here, so we have our impact tubes right here, which are shown in yellow. So we have impact tube right here, and we have the Venturi suction over here, which is going to pull the poppet to the left. We have the pressure is going to move it to the left, and this time we have the inlet pressure, fuel inlet pressure in dark red coming here, pushing it to the right. We've called that, so we called this A, we called this B, we called this C. And then over here in D is our metered fuel pressure. Remember, D is less now than in C, right? So as our air metering force goes up, it's going to move the poppet to the left. As fuel metering force goes up, it'll move the poppet to the right, and we need them both in equilibrium. And we talked about the fact that we have a constant head idle spring right in here that is helping us with idle, and we have a constant effort spring right in here that assists the air metering force at all times. All right, so fuel is going to come in through the fuel inlet through the screen and down to this chamber right here, where we're going to look and find out how does this actually regulate our idle fuel while the constant head idle spring is in effect and holding the poppet off its valve with no air coming through. So as fuel enters in the fuel screen and it comes to this area right here, we need to talk about these two shafts right here and understand what they're connected to. So this one right here is simply the red knob in the cockpit, manual mixture control and idle cutoff. So it is connected directly from this point to the cockpit. The pilot controls this valve right here. So in the full rich position, fuel is going to come in through here into this chamber right here. At the same time, it's going to come through here and around and back down. So we have that pressure measurement down in here. All right, so fuel comes through here and it gets to the main metering jet. Well, we could actually call that kind of a main metering / idle jet, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. But this particular shaft right here is connected directly to the throttle right here. So when the throttle plate moves, this moves in conjunction with it. So I think the best way to understand something like this is to take a look at an actual servo here and to see what's going on. So right here on this side, we have the manual mixture control. So right here is an idle cutoff. We can pull it all the way back, and that would be full rich. So full rich would be forward, pull it back to idle cutoff, and that would shut down the engine. So this is connected again to the red knob inside of the cockpit. You can see right there where it says ICO, that stands for idle cutoff. And then the opposite would be full rich. Now on the other side, right here, you can see this is the shaft right here that goes to what's called the idle valve lever. So even though it's the idle valve lever, it is actually connected through this mechanism right here to this shaft right here, with this arm that is connected directly to the cockpit. That'd be the black throttle arm, and that directly controls the throttle plate right there. So there's idle. And if we go forward with the engine control, that is going to move that into wide open. And it also moved this at the same time. So pull it back to idle, and we go back to wide open throttle. So you can see as the air valve moves, so does this valve right here, or the shaft right here, connected, or what is called the idle valve lever. All right, so now let's take a look and see what is going on the inside of these right here. All right, so I've opened up and I've taken out both of the shafts and the arms, along with everything that is inside of there. So if we took a look through there right now, you'd see that there's actually nothing inside of there. It's all laying out right here in front of me. And looking at the drawing, we can see that fuel is going to come in through the fuel inlet. Looking back at the carburetor, here's the fuel inlet right there. And if we unscrew this, we will see there's the screen right there. So when you maintain these and you pull this apart, it's very important to note which end to open up, because I could open up this right here and pull the screen out in theory. On most of the new ones you can't now, or I have to disconnect the hose to get to this. Well, the harder way to do it is to disconnect the hose, but that's the right way, because you disconnect the hose and then you're going to pull this out, and any debris should be on the inside of this screen. And so to clean this out, then you would use some solvent on here to clean it out, compressed air, and inspect it. But if you were to open it up the wrong way, say we open it up from this side and pull the screen out, well, what happens is you're pulling it out, you actually dump everything that could have gotten caught all the way inside of the servo, and you open up and you look at it and say, well, hey, look at that, it's nice and clean. Well, it is now, because you just dumped everything inside of here. So important to note that it comes out from this side right here, the more difficult way, because we don't want the debris to contaminate the servo unit. So put that back there. All right, so looking back at our drawing, we see that we've got the fuel coming in here, going through the fuel screen, down in this area, and it's going to come across this spring right here, and then off into this area. Here is the plate we're going to look at, and then the plug is right in here with two holes. One hole goes this way, and one hole down here. So now looking back down here at the actual parts, we see we had the fuel came in, went across this spring right here, then it went through this right here with these holes right here, allowing it to come to this side of the plate. And that only goes on one way. So we have the plate right there that goes up against this plug with the two holes. So we have one hole that is on the top right here that comes out and goes off into the fuel regulator. And then we have this hole right here, which goes through here and then off towards the left side. So that is covered up with this plate right here. Now remember, this is the mixture side, all right? So the way that's going to work is that, and thankfully that comes off right there, this will sit on here, and then as we go into idle cutoff, it will block off both of those holes. And then as we enrich in the mixture, first it will go through this slot right here, which gets wider and wider, allowing more fuel until we keep getting wider and wider. And eventually we will let fuel in through both of these holes right here. So that is the way that works right there. As this plate opens up, we let fuel initially come through this slot right here until it opens up to a point where fuel is going out of both of these holes. That would be the maximum amount of fuel. So it's going to come through here into this back of the chamber right here. Actually, this is going to sit just like that. And then it's going to come into this chamber right here. Now, this one has the hole drilled going down, and in the drawing, it shows it going up. It does not matter, of course, if it's up or down, but it's going to come through this side right here where it goes onto the idle valve lever. So this one is the one that's connected to the throttle, and it's going to work very similar to what we just looked at. At a idle speed, this little slot right there is going to barely uncover the hole that is coming out through right there. And then as we open the throttle more and more, then the valve is going to open up until a point where this hole right there, or this orifice, which is the metering orifice, is going to be wide open, doing all the metering through that orifice, going off into the flow divider and then fuel nozzles from there. So that's what's going on inside right there. So looking back here at our color diagram, we can once again take a look at the fuel flow through the system. So fuel is going to come in through the screen, enter into this chamber right here. It is going to go through the manual mixture control lever, which will allow fuel to go through one of two passages into this chamber right here, which then is allowed to go through the main metering jet, which is controlled through the idle valve right here that is also connected to the throttle. So at idle settings, it will restrict this opening right here and meter fuel at idle. Once we are off idle and we have enough air metering force down in this area, then air metering force and fuel metering force will control the poppet valve. And this will then be the main meter. Oh, it's always the main metering jet, which then meters fuel through here. Actually, it doesn't meter fuel. It controls the pressure on either side. So fuel then comes this way down through this pink area right here into the metered fuel pressure. So we have metered fuel pressure on this side, and we've already talked about the air metering force and the fuel metering force, but the fuel is coming this way into the poppet valve. And as the poppet valve moves to the left, because we have more air metering force, because the engine is taking in more air, then fuel is going to flow out this way, and fuel is going to flow over through here, through the outlet of the servo and into the flow divider. Now, once we enter the flow divider, this flow divider is different than the way Continental has their flow divider operating. So this one is designed, the flow divider on the RSA is designed to help meter fuel at idle, where the Continental flow divider, well, they don't call it a flow divider, but it is designed to open suddenly and not meter fuel. So this one does meter fuel. So fuel is going to come in through this chamber right here, enter this tube right here, and press up on a diaphragm. So that diaphragm is then, as fuel pressure is here, is going to press up on the diaphragm, opening this poppet valve right here and start pressing it up. Well, in here, there's what they call a V slot. So at low pressures here, this is going to press up on the diaphragm, which has to fight against a spring, and it will only open a little, and that will only create a small opening in the V slots, regulating fuel off to the fuel nozzles. Well, as fuel pressure in the line here, this brown increases, it will open up the poppet valve more until the V slots are no longer in effect. And so there's no restriction right here. And the next restriction simply becomes the nozzle outlet. And so this flow divider does meter at lower RPMs, but once we get to high RPM, then the fuel nozzle outlet does all of the metering, or the final metering, I should say. All right, so let's talk about the fuel nozzles. Now, if you've watched the video on the Continental system, the fuel nozzles are exactly the same function, same look, same everything. They're the bleed type. And so there is a little air bleed that comes right in through here that mixes with the fuel to emulsify the fuel going out of the nozzle. And it is important that the area that the nozzle is screwed into is in the intake manifold, which is a lower pressure than the outside ambient air. So as fuel flows through here, there's a low pressure on this area that causes air to be drawn in to mix with the fuel. If this were on a turbocharged system, then you have to put a cover over this area here where you can see the yellow, and you have to then plumb this area to upper deck or turbocharger outlet pressure to ensure that this area is of a higher pressure than down here. Now, when we talk about nozzles, we need to talk about what happens if they become plugged. So it is possible that a nozzle could get plugged partially or fully here with the fuel outlet or up here where the air comes in. Now, connected to the flow divider is a cockpit instrument that is labeled in pounds per hour. It is nothing more than a pressure gauge that has been calibrated to read pounds per hour. So given all of the parameters of this system, it is then known whatever the outlet pressure is here can be calibrated to read gallons per hour. So if we knew this was, say 10 PSI, I'm just making up a number, then we would know that's exactly how many gallons. So this gauge reads in pounds per hour based upon a pressure reading. However, if any of the parameters are thrown off because of a plug anywhere, then we're going to get a false reading on the pounds per hour gauge or the fuel flow gauge. For example, if we had a blockage or either full or complete on one of the fuel nozzle fuel outlets, that is going to create more pressure buildup inside of the flow divider, which means that more fuel would want to go out to the other cylinders because there's more pressure. So this cylinder here would run lean because of the blockage, and this cylinder here would run rich because there's an increased pressure forcing more fuel out. At the same time, there's going to be more pressure here going to our pounds per hour or fuel flow gauge, which will indicate we have a higher fuel flow, even though it's really just a higher pressure. And when in fact, because we had a blockage, we might be getting a lower fuel flow. But again, it's a pressure gauge, so it's going to lie to us and say that we have a higher pressure, which is high fuel flow, when in fact, we have a high pressure situation with a low fuel flow. So you have to be careful with that. So again, this cylinder here with the blockage would run lean. All of the other ones would run rich. Now, if we had a blockage of the air coming in, that means that this low pressure right here is actually going to suck fuel in. It's going to assist in fuel going through this little orifice, which means that it's going to get more fuel coming into this particular cylinder right here because the low pressure is drawing the fuel in. So this particular cylinder is going to run a little bit richer. And because this one is stealing some of the fuel from this area here, it's going to rob fuel from all the other nozzles. So these cylinders, the rest of them would run a little bit lean. So this one runs rich because of the air blockage. The rest of them run lean. And we could see a potential lower pressure, which would indicate a lower fuel flow, which is not necessarily the case. We could actually have a higher fuel flow. It's just that we have a lower pressure. All right, last thing I want to talk about over here is the automatic mixture control. Some of these systems do have an automatic mixture control. It is an option. And the way this works is there is a bellows right here, this right here is a little accordion that's allowed to expand and contract filled with an inert gas. And so as we go up in altitude, this is going to expand, much like if you got a bag of potato chips down in the valley and went up in the mountains, you know that that bag of potato chips would expand unless you opened it and ate them, then that would not be the case. But so as long as this is intact and hasn't been opened, then what happens as the aircraft goes up in altitude, this will expand. And right here is an inverted needle. So as it expands, the smaller portion right here is going to unseat and allow a little bit of leakage. And as we go down in altitude, this is going to contract and it's going to bring this needle back up on its seat. So the higher we go up in altitude, the more this is going to expand, the more leakage we're going to get through here. And what that leakage is doing is it's just taking our two air metering forces, our right here, our suction in blue or our impact in yellow, and it's going to bleed off some of the impact into the suction. So we can follow the path right here. We're going to get this air is going to come up through here, in here, into here. And then if we go up in altitude and the needle starts to open, this impact air pressure all in here is going to bleed off into the suction, which is going to decrease the air metering force pressure here and decrease the suction right here, because instead of having a suction that's coming up right in through this area, it's going to steal some from this way, so it's going to decrease it. So as we decrease the air metering force, then the poppet is going to want to close, and that is going to then cause the air metering force to change. And of course, we're going to get less fuel out of the poppet right here because the poppet moved to the right. And as we talked about earlier, all this goes back in equilibrium. Hopefully we got that by now. So that's the automatic mixture control. Should we get a hole in the automatic mixture control and it didn't operate, then this system would operate just like one without an automatic mixture control. It would run rich as we went up to higher altitudes, and the pilot would have to compensate by pulling the manual mixture control. So that's all there is to that. So last thing in this video, let's talk about the adjustments for this carburetor. With this particular fuel injection system, there are two adjustments that you may commonly make out in the field. That is idle speed and idle adjustment. So idle speed is done with this screw right there. And all it is it controls a stop pin against a pin here, stop pin here against a screw. And as you screw this in, these two will make contact sooner, which will leave more of a space right here, allowing more air to go through. More air is more fuel, and the engine's going to run a little bit faster. If you want to run the engine slower, then we would back this screw out down here, and that would close this plate off a little bit more, meaning less air comes through. So a good idle speed is about 650 to 750. It's going to depend upon the airplane and the specific engine combination and what the manufacturer is asking for, but that is exactly how you would set it up right there. Now, idle mixture is done with this screw right here. And right there you can see an R, that stands for rich, not right, but rich, and has an arrow pointing that way. So if I want to enrich in the mixture, there's a spring back here, and all that spring does is it goes right inside of these little cutouts to hold this in place. So to enrich in this particular system, I would move the spring down a little bit and rotate this way. And what that does is you can see that it lengthens this up, right? And so when these get further apart, it adjusts the actual correlation between this shaft right here, which is controlling the butterfly here, how much air, and fine-tuning this arm right here, which, as we now know, inside of there is adjusting how much of those orifices are being exposed. So as we open it up and enrich in it, then that is going to allow those orifices down in there to receive more fuel. More fuel is going to go through the servo and out this opening right here off into the flow divider. And so to lean it out, we would just do the opposite. So just go the opposite of the R. And usually I just do like 1 or 2 clicks and see how that looks on the aircraft. Don't go crazy and do a bunch of turns. All right, and so what we're looking for is when we run the engine, all right, so we get it warmed up, we get it into an idle, a nice idle speed, and we will put this into idle cutoff, which it is right there. It says ICO right there, so we'll put this in idle cutoff, and the engine should speed up about 25 to 50 RPM and die. And what that indicates is that it was running a little richer than best power, right? So a little richer than best power. And then as I cut off the fuel, it went through running a little bit too rich to running at best power and suddenly die. And so when it hits that best power, the engine is going to speed up just a little tiny bit, 25 to 50 RPM, indicating that we were 25 to 50 RPM rich of best power. And that's where these are set up. So if I were
were running it and I had it in the rich position, and then I go to idle cutoff and it just dies, that indicates that we're on the lean side already. And we don't want to be on the lean side, we want a rich side. So we have to then enrich in it until we get that rise. If we did that and put it in idle cutoff and it went 150 RPM rise and then drop, that indicates it's too rich and we have to lean it out. So again, this is the idle speed right there, and the idle mixture is adjusted right here, even though the arm is way over here. And keep in mind, if you adjust the idle speed first and then adjust the idle mixture, as you adjust the idle mixture, you could end up increasing the idle RPM or decreasing depending on how far out this was right here. So I like to set this first and then do my final adjustments here. But in order to do that, you'd have to back this all the way out, make sure it's not interfering with what you're doing. Set the speed in the cockpit where you want it, idle mixture, set it up here. And then when you're very happy with it, then in the cockpit while you're running it, we will set this to a spot in the cockpit where it runs just where we want it, and then adjust the screw right here to touch right there. So there we go. That is the Bendix RSA Fuel Injection System.